Hello and welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman. You can find the show notes and the transcript for this episode at umbrex.com/unleashed. And if you sign up for the newsletter for Unleashed, you'll also get a weekly email from me with some bonus material. I am delighted to be here today with Bart Sayer, who is a former senior vice president at Estee Lauder. We are going to be talking about how to analyze a cosmetics company. And the companion resource for this episode is a resource that Umbrex has published called How to Analyze a Cosmetics Company. We'll include a link for that resource in the show notes. You can also find it by going to the resources tab on umbrex.com and just scrolling down to that resource. Bart, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Will. It's good to be here with you.
So before we dive into a bunch of questions, first, maybe just give us a bit of an overview of your background at Booz and at Estee Lauder and so forth.
Yeah, happy to. Basically, two quick chapters. The first was in consulting, where I was a partner in the consumer and retail practice of Booz and Company, subsequently called strategy and member firm of PWC. And then 10 years back, joined ELC, where I had three different roles, the Estee Lauder companies, the latest of which was as SVP, General Manager of Clinique's international business, which is roughly $1 billion book, all outside of the United States and Canada.
Cool. Before we dive into these, going through some of these analyses that are listed in the resource, give us a bit of an overview of the cosmetics industry and maybe almost start with Estee Lauder. Now, some people who buy the products may know this, but some people might not be super aware of it, that Estee Lauder, of course, is its own brand, but it's also this umbrella of brands. And so talk to us about the major cosmetic companies that are umbrella brands and just the other types of companies you encounter in the cosmetics world. Help us understand the structure.
Yeah, happy to. It's a very dynamic space to begin with, and I think most of your listeners would know that. You know, the US market alone is north of 60 billion. It's roughly evenly split between what I would call prestige and luxury and the mass brands. And as you allude to, what you often find is that these companies that have names like Estee Lauder house in reality multiple brands, multiple portfolios of brands. So to take but the example of ELC, Estee Lauder companies, we have north of 20 different brands. There's the eponymous Estee Lauder, which was the namesake of the founder. But then you have other brands such as Clinique, on which I worked, MAC, and so on. And I would say that that's the rough rule of thumb for the overall industry. It is very rare, not just in beauty, but I would say more largely in personal care and consumer goods writ large, to find indie brands. You'll have indie brands that come up through the ranks that do something which is differentiating, and we can talk about that at some point. But invariably, they get acquired. And what we have for Estee Lauder companies holds equally true for L'Oreal, the world's largest beauty player, not in luxe, but overall in terms of mass and luxe. The L'Oreal family, which is based out of France, houses everything from mass brands like L'Oreal Paris and Maybelline to luxury brands such as Lancôme. So what you find is that structure, that notion of having these conglomerates, L'Oreal, Estee Lauder company, Shiseido based out of Japan, Puig, which is based out of Spain, and so on, or Coty, even based out of New York. In reality, they house multitudes of brands, and they have a portfolio approach to developing the market.
Okay. Talk to us a bit the different segments. You mentioned mass market, you mentioned prestige. These are typically sold in very different venues and so forth. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, happy to. So maybe I'll start with just a very basic premise, which is that when you think about beauty, the four main verticals or category verticals, if you will, are skincare, makeup, hair care, and body. So that's the way you think about the product structure. And I would say that, most of the momentum and excitement as of late has been around skincare, but fragrances are really on the upswing. We can talk a bit more about that later. In terms of the split between the market, as I mentioned in the United States, if you go off of value, not units, but value, it's pretty evenly split between the luxe and the mass end. Luxury tends to grow quicker. These are publicly available figures, but you'll find that the forecast for, let's say, luxury beauty, the growth is reckoned to be anywhere between 6 and 8% for the foreseeable future. Whereas on the mass side of things, you're looking at a more modest rate of growth of called 2 to 4%. So that's the way the overall market dynamic looks. It's quite healthy and quite dynamic, as I mentioned before. Now, in terms of where we're sold or the channels of distribution, to your point, you'll find that the prestige brands are more available in what we would call department stores or in specialty multi. Specialty multi is in essence in the United States, Sephora and Ulta. And obviously the third channel of distribution being direct to consumer. Whereas the more mass brands are what we call drugstore brands, right? You can find them at anywhere from your Walgreens to your CVS and so on and so forth. So at Estee Lauder companies, we had a saying that I think comes from Leonard Lauder himself, whereby your distribution defines your equity. So as you might imagine, the prestige brands are very careful and choiceful about where they show up. And that's why decisions such as, for example, do we go onto a platform such as Amazon, which reaches hundreds of millions of households? Do we go after that or not? Is it worth the price? Are we able to maintain our equity while going into a place like that?
And what about some of the specialty channels? Like I know I have a friend who actually built a company via QVC primarily. And there's also travel retail. And so talk about some of the specialty kind of channels.
Specialty channels, some of which you mentioned there, are very exciting. I mean, QVC is a juggernaut. There's no other way to put it. It reaches 50 million viewers, if you will, tend to be more of a female demographic, 45, 50 plus, avid users of beauty. I have a friend who just launched an indie brand and spoke on QVC for the first time a week and a half ago. And when I say that that is the ultimate coming out party, I cannot emphasize that strongly enough. So clearly, Home Shopping Network, QVC, which are owned by the same entity, are an amazing place to have exposure to brands, not just mass, but often very premium priced entities as well. When you think more broadly, and that's within the United States, and I think that structure is replicated in certain markets as well, though I'm less familiar with the QVCs of the world elsewhere. You mentioned travel retail. It's a division for which I actually worked when I was at ELC. That's a phenomenal growth vehicle. And, it's interesting because when you're a Westerner, let's say based in the United States, you think of shopping in airports as being a somewhat meh experience. The retail doesn't look that great. There's often out of stocks, so on. But as you migrate further east, starting with Europe, but then particularly when you get to Asia, the level of brand equity exposure that you can get is absolutely phenomenal. The shopping malls that you'll find at Incheon Airport, at Changi, in Singapore, are second to none. And I truly mean that in terms of the quality of the boutique, the level of education of the sales associates that you can meet. It's really the most elevated shopping experience that one can find. And frankly, it's more than just what you find in store. There are ways to shop before you travel, after you return back from your point of travel, and have the product delivered to you. So in many ways, travel retail has been a phenomenal growth vehicle for multiple brands. However, that's really more of a prestige and luxury phenomenon rather than mass.
Okay. All right. Behind the scenes here, can you tell us the actual stuff in the bottle or in the jar between mass and prestige? Is it really pretty much the same ingredients with just a nicer label on it in prestige, or is there a fundamental difference in the ingredients and what you're actually buying?
There is. And I think that, it was Lindsay Owen Jones, who was the 2 or 3 CEOs past head of L'Oreal, said that if all we're selling is hope in a jar, we're kind of doomed. And I fundamentally believe that. Listen, when you pay for a premium product, what are you buying? You're buying a level of service for sure. You have what we call demonstration, the fact that someone has taken the time to understand what your skin concerns are, let's say, before trying to pitch you a product. So there's that level of consultation, which is something which is prized. There's a level of packaging, which no doubt also plays a role. People like to have something that looks nice on the shelf. But to your question as to whether intrinsically the product is superior, I think the answer is undoubtedly yes. It's not just about the quality of the ingredients. And frankly, not all ingredients are created equal, but it's also about the formulation philosophy, how you bring all these ingredients together in an efficacious way, how you find a way of pushing efficacy to the furthest boundary possible while also maintaining the highest levels of safety. There's also an extra level of, I would say, protections that are put in place by a lot of the prestige brands to ensure that the products are safe for sensitive skin, people who suffer from atopic dermatitis, people who suffer from psoriasis, and so on and so forth. So I would say that ingredients are not all created equal. Formulation philosophies vary widely. Allergy testing is also highly variable across these different entities. So putting that all together, I think when you buy a prestige product, you're intrinsically getting something which is of higher quality, likely to meet higher safety standards, and to be safer for certain types of skin conditions of which many people tend to suffer.
Amazing. Let's jump into some of these analyses. So on this resource, there's 45 different detailed analyses. that we walk through the goal of the analysis, the data required, step-by-step instructions, and how to interpret the results and steps a company can take to improve on that measure. We are not going to go through all 45, but I think you picked a few that you wanted to to talk about. You just go. What's the first one you want to get into?
Well, why don't we go from top to bottom? And indeed, we're not going to go through all 46, but we can touch on each one of the chapters if you wish. So if we start at product and research development, a couple of things caught my eye here. I think it's the idea that the testing is really, really important. So just before you were asking about the difference between a mass brand and a prestige brand, the notion of coming up with clinical testing, a battery of tests to ensure that we have clinical proof that a product does what it claims it can do is immensely difficult to undertake. It requires usually a third-party entity to help conduct the test. You have to recruit a panel. And depending upon the duration of what you're looking to prove out, that can take anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks. So I would say that when you think about differentiating your product, going beyond what we call sensorial claims, which is I feel, or asking a consumer how she or he may feel after having used a product. I feel like my skin looks better. I believe I've seen some good improved results, versus we can demonstrably prove scientifically by a medical body that in fact this product has reduce your crow's feet around your eyes, reduce wrinkles along the forehead and whatnot. That's a very big deal. So I'd say that when you think about the tests that companies have to undertake, the litmus test really is being able to prove that you have clinical claims to support what you're saying your product in fact can do. And I would say that that is a very high barrier to entry, even in a world like today where you have a lot of indie brands that are entering the market. So from a product and research and development standpoint, that would be point number one. The second I would say is that, while R&D in product development, conceptualization, if you will, is a core competency of these larger companies, I would say that large and small have been pushing more and more to leverage contract manufacturers. The production itself is something which is time consuming. Formulation philosophies change. Speed to market is of primordial importance. So while that has enabled smaller brands to get into the market quicker, I would argue that even the larger companies, anyone from a L'Oreal to an ELC to a Pooch in this day and age, is working with anywhere from, call it 5 to 7 different third-party contract manufacturers to ensure that they're getting access to the latest ingredients, the latest formulation philosophies, and so on.
Interesting. So the cosmetics companies are often not manufacturing in their own factories. They are outsourcing that piece in some cases. What is it that the cosmetic company actually does? They come up with the brand, they come up with the formulation, I suppose, and they give the ingredient list to the contract manufacturer?
Yeah, they do a ton. So, well, first off, to clarify one point, it's a blend, right? To be very clear, it's a blended model. L'Oreal has, I think, over 40 different manufacturing facilities around the world. So it's not either or, it's not binary at all. And so what the cosmetics companies or the beauty companies are in fact doing is they're coming up with the formulation philosophies behind their products. They're selecting the ingredients that they think should be shortlisted. They're designing the battery of tests that have to take place. And obviously they're selecting which categories and subcategories they should be getting into. And that's just from a pure R&D product development standpoint. I'm not getting into all the other work that they'll do between marketing and commercial decisions as well to bring these products to life.
Oh, okay, cool. What do you want to talk about next?
Well, let's keep going. So chapter 2 was marketing and consumer insights. And look, I think here there are a couple things that caught my eye. What I would say is, you talk about social media. It's very interesting to see the way that, and I think this is part of why people are often very attuned to what happens in the beauty space, how much of a trend-driven category in fact can be. And what's been interesting to see happen over the past couple of years is how the media model, the marketing model, has evolved from being, let's say, paid media led to one whereby it's really about seizing upon organic buzz in the marketplace, what we call more of an earned media led model, whereby you see a trend, you figure out how your product or your category of products can help to play a part in that trend, and then you amplify thereafter on social channels. And I think the social media led first approach was probably more prominent in beauty than in other categories. So, TikTok and Instagram and whatnot, these platforms have been front and center for how beauty companies go to market and how they think about marketing to their consumers for a long, long period of time. So that's point number one, which I think is really quite critical to grasp. The second is that when you talk at one point about local versus global adaptation, the notion of finding a locally relevant articulation of the brand essence is really, really critical. There are many brands that have had one essence, let's say in the West, but then when it came to moving to the China market, found a different way of talking about their bona fides. So just to give you but a simple, but I think telling example, when you think about skincare products, the reasons to believe that you have to put on the table to convince a Chinese consumer that your product is truly top-notch are far greater. They require a burden of proof and a level of scientific explanations and credentialing that a Western consumer would not need to have. I also think related to this topic is the notion of having a local face to generate awareness for your brands. And I think a lot of the large beauty companies have become quite adept at saying, yes, they have their global ambassadors who can speak for the brand. But ultimately, if you don't have a local face to really hook the consumer further down the funnel, you're not going to get the traction that you need to. So it's a delicate balance, if you will, I think, in terms of marketing between two things. One is, again, being more reactive to market trends and being able to put your toe in the water first with an earned media-led approach on social media platforms. And secondly, ensuring that you're part of a locally relevant conversation, both in terms of the platforms and messaging, but also the talent that you're going to be tapping into.
Mm-hmm. So that seems to suggest that going forward, we may see more of a kind of shift to more indie brands or newer brands, because on paid media, you can there's a huge advantage for the big brands. You can afford TV, but for the social media, it's not very exciting to go and say, guess what? I just discovered this great product. It's called L'Oreal or,
Yeah.
Whereas it's not new and novel. And if you're doing something on TikTok, you probably want to do something that is new and bringing new insights to your audience.
No, 100%, 100%. I mean, look, I think there's several reasons why indie brands have been exploding, and this isn't new, right? This has been going on for the better part of, I'd say, 15 years. But if you try to summarize it into three buckets, one of which is exactly what you said, the fact that on social media channels, the barriers to entry are far lower, and it plays more to an agile marketing model that I think the legacy companies have been slower to grasp. They've been playing more catch up, if you will, whereas these indie brands were digitally native. They grew up on TikTok. They grew up on Instagram. So I think that's point number one. Point number two is the theme that we spoke about before of contract manufacturers, the fact that they continue to grow their footprints. And so all of a sudden, you no longer have to have your own production facility to get to the market, which is, needless to say, a huge, huge thing. It's not that contract manufacturing is new in any of the, I would say, consumer goods space. But I think the degree of sophistication of the players has grown exponentially over the past decade or so. And the third thing is the channel partners themselves. The number one juggernaut for beauty retail sales in the United States these days, at least from a premium standpoint, is Sephora. And that's no secret to, I'm sure, a lot of your listeners today. The fact of the matter is the Sephora model is predicated on finding indie brands that can be found nowhere else. That's part of the fun of the discovery. So you put those three things together, and there's a very clear reason why the indie brands are continuing to gain sizable market share in the United States and other parts of the world.
What's the sort of minimum viable cosmetics companies these days, Bart? Let's say a TikTok influencer comes to you and says, "Hey, Bart, I think I'd like to start a cosmetics brand, and I'd like you to help me." Could just the two of you do it? Like, you could outsource the production. I suppose you'd need someone to design the packaging and stuff, but can one or two people now start their own indie brand?
One or two. So full disclosure, I've yet to do such a thing.
This is speculative. To be clear, it's speculative.
No, I like the provocation. I would say 1 to 2 feels a bit too modest, but a handful of folks called teams of 5 to 10. I've actually seen and heard of taking place. Again, speaking of a dear friend who just launched. I mean, she was able to go live on PWC with fewer than, call it, 10 people on the roster.
This is a mutual friend. Let's give her a shout out, right? This is Surby, right? Surby Grover.
This is Surby Grover, exactly. I'm blown away with what she was able to achieve. And when you're able to go on a platform like PWC and sell through in the space of 9 minutes $125,000 worth of product, that is truly, truly phenomenal. So look, I think to answer your question, assuming that you have something which is truly differentiating, yes, the problem is not so much the launch, it's the stickiness, right? And I think that's where a lot of these companies fall flat. It's in the repeat purchase. So the shiny new object will, of course, attract interest from different consumers, but the repeat purchases is where these things really, truly tend to fall off.
Okay, cool. So, and let's give Surby a shout out. Surby Grover. Company is Love, Indus, Indus. We'll include We'll include links to Serbi's company in the show notes. A good friend of both Bart and me.
Yes.
Let's go on to sales and distribution.
Sales and distribution. Well, look, I think we hit upon some of this stuff. I would say that your introductory questions really hit at some of the keynotes. The fact of the matter is, you can't have a distribution conversation writ large. I think there are a couple of global phenomena. There are a couple of global players. I mentioned Sephora before, which is growing hand over fist. Sephora is, for those of your audience who don't know this, is owned by the LVMH group. It's a leading premium beauty retailer in the world, and they have operations, frankly, everywhere from North and South America to Europe and Asia, China, whatnot. So let's begin by saying that, if there were to be maybe 2 or 3 global phenomenon channels that really do matter from a distribution standpoint, it's specialty multi-Sephora first and foremost. I would say secondly is travel retail, as you mentioned before. And then third, you find that there are certain e-tailers which are thriving. So if you think, for example, over in Europe, you have Zalando or Notino. So players that really more specialize in the space that are continuing to grow substantially. So I think as a general rule, without talking about direct to consumer, which remains obviously relevant for all brands, but as a general rule, if you think about sort of third party relationships, those are the 3 to bear in mind. Boning up on your direct to consumer is obviously important, but you have to fish where the fish are. So I'd say from a distribution standpoint, those are the general places where people have to play. Now, on the flip side of the ledger, what you find is that more traditional points of distribution, so be it a department store, or what in Europe one might call a perfumery. Those have seen slower growth. Those have seen far slower growth. And I think department store, the story of how that channel of distribution has been on a bit of a slow secular decline is not specific to beauty. That's more of I would say, a broader trend that we're seeing in the market. But ensuring that, you, as the CEO of Estee Lauder companies would put it, that you put your boat in the wind is absolutely critical. If you find that you're really dedicating too much of your firepower, your resources to legacy channels, it's going to be difficult to pivot and to win in these other places where, frankly, one of the number one obstacles you often find is that you do not have demonstration. Now I'm thinking more about a prestige brand, but as I mentioned before, what differentiates a prestige brand is the quality of the demonstration or the consultation you get, it's the packaging, and then obviously it's the ingredients themselves. When you move into some of these newer channels, you don't always have the benefit of having a salesperson there who can help to educate you on what's happening. So figuring out how you kit the brand differently for more of a self-navigated experience or self-navigation by the consumer is a big challenge that a lot of companies are struggling with.
Let's go on to the next one.
Okay. Well, listen, I think in terms of operations and supply chain, looking at this, I feel like we've hit upon most of the themes here. I think that stating the obvious, clean beauty is more than a transitory phenomenon. It's something which is absolutely here to stay.
Clean beauty, what's that mean? That means like green and sustainable and...
Yeah, paraben-free, sulfate-free, free of certain types of ingredients, free of fragrances. So yes, and I think it's a moniker that I think used to be quite general, green beauty, clean beauty, but now is getting more teeth and specificity behind it because you have certain bodies such as Sephora that have their own clean beauty categorization. So because of this, I think it's raising the bar for a lot of brands to prove their bona fides in terms of not just ingredient publishing, but talking about the sourcing of the ingredients, which is really quite key.
What about some of the challenges that might not be so visible to consumers on supply chain? Like I imagine that there's some shelf life issues, like you have to, it only lasts so long and you have to dispose of it at certain points. So that means the stores have to send it back to the manufacturer and they have to dispose of it. And I imagine another challenge could be a big proliferation of SKUs. Like sometimes there's Christmas specials or they package a couple things together, or there could be different sizes. I'm curious about just the operational and supply chain complexity.
Yeah, very fair. Let me answer what I can. So I think just directly in terms of shelf life, the rule of thumb, let's say in skincare, is that from the point at which the bottle is filled to the point at which it should no longer be sold through to a consumer, you have roughly 3 years. So, the first barrier to overcome is, from filling to getting it out to your retailer's hands. Sometimes that can take up to a year.
Wait, a year? So they've made it and it's sort of sitting in warehouses or in the supply chain a year. Wow.
It could. It depends on the quality of your demand forecasting, right? Your demand planning function. So, listen, I think there's a lot of timing issues, including if you miss a window for selling into your key retail partners, right? So, but long story short, you have roughly 3 years from the moment you fill to the moment in which it has to be consumed by your consumer. And different geographies or different nationalities, if you will, have different varying degrees of rigor that they apply to that. If you go all the way east, again, to the Asian consumer, speaking writ large, let's say the Chinese consumer, are much more, I would say, finicky about such things. You probably have more like 2.5 years, but from the manufacture date, after which the consumer will say, I'm not going to touch it. And by the way, the retailers enforce the same level of rules. If your product doesn't have a shelf life, I'll call it 1 year from the date of manufacturing, they're not even going to buy it, sell it. So that's, I think, the first point. You ask about SKU proliferation, and that is indeed an issue, especially in a world where, part of how brands are trying to create buzz and excitement is with, I would say, limited edition collections. Now, you find that most apparently over the holidays, a holiday advent calendar, a special gift with purchase bag, which is co-branded with a fashion entity like Kate Spade. The goal is obviously to sell through, but, getting those quantities right is a very torturous process. So invariably, you either under or you over index on that. And then what do? I think this is one reason why, given the volatility in forecasting some of these, what we call key shopping moments, if you will, brands have tried to err on the side of, I think, less sell through, create the FOMO, and also to have fewer times a year where they make a bet on at least product pack differentiation. One area to give you an example of that is, let's say, Lunar New Year, where for a long, long time, many, many brands, and some still do in fairness, would come up with special packaging for, let's say, the Year of the Dragon or whatnot. But listen, when that doesn't sell through, there's very little that you can do with that packaging, which is so specific to that particular holiday. And arguably the same thing holds for Christmas, right? So rather than say we're going to be driving differentiation and, as you pointed out, SKU proliferation through pack design, we can do it more through how we kit out our stores, how we create a sense of holiday cheer or whatnot through the store design, through the VM that we're showing, the signage, things of that nature. So SKU proliferation, is indeed a problem. And I think the notion of betting on fewer products and being more hero-driven in how you build out your portfolio is a huge, huge necessity, especially, I would argue, in beauty, whereby the challenge is that newness is what drives excitement behind the category. That's how you get consumers to keep coming back. So how do you find that balance between getting new out there, but also sticking to your knittings, building out your heroes more and more, and trying to be much more choiceful in the limited edition collections that you put out there?
Now, you mentioned how you kit out your stores. In department stores, how much control do the cosmetics brands have over their floor space? Is it kind of do whatever you want, or you have to get the Bloomingdale's to sign off on it? Or like how much control do you have over what your signage and display looks like in your space?
A ton. And it's interesting because I get the question often, well, do you beauty brands, do you really know what it means to be direct to consumer? Because so much of what you do is wholesale. But what I often remind folks is that it's not an arm's length wholesale relationship whereby we're selling in product and then they figure out how to kit out the shelf, if you will. What we create are stores within stores. We have armies of people. And by we, I mean all, let's say the prestige beauty. Again, I think it's important that your audience understand that I'm couching my arguments from a prestige beauty standpoint. Mass is a different story. Mass is equipped and kitted out much like you'd find for everything from laundry detergent to cookies or traditional food and beverage. But if I go back to prestige and you're asking about department stores, which would only house prestige brands, everything from what we call, there's armies of store design and visual merchandising people who think about the layout of the store, how many gondolas we're going to have, how the back walls are going to be set. We design the planogram. We decide what the uniforms are for the associates who work in the store. We design the training regimens for them. We think about how we're going to change the look and feel of the stores for different holiday seasons. So all of that has been given over to the beauty brands to control, because I think the retailers, the department stores, rightfully recognize that there's no one who's better placed to do that. Now, listen, there are times when you're going to have a secondary placement in the store, maybe closer to the cash till, where those are multi-brand. And obviously what you're looking to do is capitalize on a last minute, more impulsive purchase. But for the core of what's being done in these department stores, which are, I would say, operated, not owned, but operated and, let's say, co-managed with the department stores, the degrees of freedom are really quite huge. And frankly, in a lot of these department stores, even the staffing model can be one of 50-50 in terms of covering the compensation for these people. So in many ways, the department stores are a very clear and direct extension of the brand's control and the brand's building out of their equity.
Wait, that's so interesting. So those folks, are they technically employees of Bloomingdale's, or are they employees of Estee Lauder, or how does that work?
There's no one rule. I mean, it really does vary. There's certain very select doors whereby the employees of these department stores do in fact belong to, let's say, a L'Oreal.
Oh,
In most instances, you're dealing with a 50-50 arrangement on everything from staffing costs to CapEx, what we call the build out or the renovation of a store. And then in select instances as well, you have the beauty advisors working directly just for the department store itself.
they work for the department store, but the beauty brand would train them, give them their talking points, give them their uniforms. So effectively, they're kind of getting trained and following the rules of the beauty brand, but they get paid by the department store.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's
Huh.
exactly right. So that's very much why, regardless of the status of or how one is compensated, if you will, be advisor, these individuals are always viewed as direct extensions of the brand and part of the family. There's
Huh.
no differentiation there.
That's so interesting. Okay. Um, and well, let's kind of get to the last couple categories here.
Okay, what did we not hit upon? So
I don't know. I think we talked a little bit about compliance across the thing, about there's a lot of safety standards to meet. Um, Maybe finance. Talk to me a little bit about just gross margin analysis. What's sort of the range that you see? I imagine it's a lot higher for the prestige brands because they have so much fixed cost to cover. But what's the typical gross margin? The sale price minus the cost to produce these things.
look, gross margins can be 65% plus, easy, and it varies, right? I mean, I think the highest gross margin categories, and again, this is no trade secret, are skincare, right? And then the other end of the spectrum, you have makeup, right? Which is lower price points, more costly to manufacture. So from a gross margin standpoint, it's a very healthy industry. And then what you find is when you try to go down then to EBITDA or net operating profit, that's where much more of the investments come in than you would, let's say, find on the mass side, in terms of having your people that we just spoke a lot about and all the marketing investments that have to take place. So, look, overall, I would say that, it's a highly lucrative business. And, operating profits or net operating profits of the larger entities are anywhere from, 10 to 20, 25%. So again, I think when you compare this to obviously the NOP of a retailer, much less a mass player, clearly a very attractive series of profit pools to get after. So that I would say is the macro picture of how you think about this. And regardless of the healthy gross margins one might have, there's always what we would call a COGS revolution or a war on the cost of goods to ensure that we continue to keep things down. We talked earlier about the need for continual innovation, the need for coming out with limited edition packs. All that comes with a hefty price tag. So thinking through, remember the best way to improve your gross margin is to increase price realization. So yes, you can get your input costs down, but the first thing is to think about whether you're pricing up appropriately for innovation. I think the premiumization trend is a very real thing, which is continuing across categories and subcategories. So that's point number one. And also ensuring that your mix is optimized for margin. I mean, I think a lot of times we lose sight of that. We get excited by the bright, shiny object, but to the point that I made earlier, to the extent that you can focus more on your creative heroes, that's going to lift all ships, and that's going to give you the breathing room that you need to invest much more in the Marcom investments we need to create the brand desirability. So I would say that when you think about gross margin, you're in a good starting point when you're in prestige. But if you're not thinking about price realization, optimizing your mix, much less obviously than all the manufacturing inputs and how you can play with, let's say, third parties to get those costs down, you're doing yourself a gross disservice.
Amazing. Bart, thank you for the primer on the cosmetics industry and going through some of these analyses. Where can listeners find you online?
Well, I would say that for now, the best place is to hunt me out either on Umbrex or through my LinkedIn profile. I don't have a more visible web front, if you will, but we'll start with that and we'll branch out over time.
Great. We'll include your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Bart, thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Will. Great talking to you.